Hi. So I had this math class in high school where we were required to get a graphing calculator, like everybody. And this was before smartphones, though. So it was a really big deal when we figured out that you could put games on those things. And so I spent the rest of the semester playing Tetris on my calculator instead of paying attention. Now, I didn't learn very much math, but I did drastically improve my Tetris ability. I'm still pretty good at Tetris from that. So what we're kind of looking at here is if general everyday hobbies, activities like Tetris that involve some sort of spatial thinking could improve your spatial ability in general. Okay, so why? Because spatial ability is malleable. We know we can improve it with lab tasks, explicitly training them on spatial tasks, but could just everyday spatial experience have the same effect? That would be nice if it does, because we also know that more spatial skill is generally related to more success with STEM. It's also just used every day to get around, to find the convention center and not get lost. So it's just a useful ability. Let's take a step back for a second. Spatial ability is not unidimensional. It's complicated. You can break it down to a million subcomponents. Luckily, you guys have already kind of explained a little bit about what large scale spatial ability means. So when we talk about large scale spatial, we're saying stuff where you're thinking about moving through space. It's outside your own body. You're moving yourself through the space. Whereas small scale spatial ability would be stuff that you're manipulating, like an object that's smaller than your body. It's all right here. So an example of activities that would tap large scale spatial ability would be like hiking, camping, anything, reading a map, probably distance estimation that you're talking about. Small scale obviously would be like video games, manipulating objects, like sports involve that too, kind of. So this isn't a new idea. There are other spatial activity questionnaires that have looked at these. Just to sum up a lot of interesting research on one slide, a lot of studies looking at activities use the original spatial activities questionnaire from Nora Newcomb's group. There's also a short version of that by Signorella et al. The questionnaires generally correlate, so the activities generally correlate 0.2 to 0.3 with small scale spatial measures like the mental rotations test. And then a lot of these were looking at sex differences. So we see men participating just in more overall activities, but also performing better on the spatial measures, but again, only specific measures. It's not every kind of spatial ability. And then we've also seen sometimes spatial activities mediate these sex differences in the performance on the spatial test. So goals of the present study, what's missing from the previous work? We want to add large scale activities. So basically the older questionnaires focus mostly on activities that seem to tap small scale spatial ability. There's nothing that would include thinking about large scale spaces. So we want to add those types of activities. And we also want to add modern type of things like Pokemon Go that didn't exist in the 80s. We also want to try to identify categories that might be more useful beyond masculine versus feminine. So again, a lot of these studies looked at sex differences. So, they coded the activities as masculine versus feminine. Of course, that has changed in the last 40 years and doesn't necessarily make sense to look at them like that anymore. And then we can look at the correlations with these categories and various measures of spatial abilities. And also we can see if there's sex differences in the categories. So just in terms of participation. Cool. So we had 161 participants, roughly college age. We're calling this measure SoCal SAQ. So it's the short version of the SAQ, which is 30 items plus 35 new items that we added either from other surveys or that we just thought of in the lab. And then we had a few large scale measures and a few small scale measures. So to try to see that distinction, this was all online through Qualtrics. Okay, so this is how we ask the question. So this varies a lot in the other questionnaires, but we worded it as the following activities. I don't know why I have this on. Rate each one on a scale from 1 to 6. 1 indicates you've never participated in the activity at all. 6 is that you do it every day or more. And then answer about the time in your life when you were most engaged in this activity. So if you used to play the sport a lot, you don't play it anymore, you'd still answer a 6. Okay, these are the tests. If you've never seen some of these before, money roadmap test is like your answer. You're indicating if you turn right or left at each number. So it's like a large scale measure, kind of like map reading. The 2D mental rotation tests we had were cards and flags. So basically you see the example flag and then you have to select which ones are the same flag rotated. And then the top right one here is the produce spatial visualizations test. And basically the rotations are applied to that top object, and then you have to apply the same rotation to the one below the line. So it's a 3D mental rotations test. So those three are all small scale. Okay, so we had some activities that averaged almost a 1, so nobody was doing baton twirling, for example. So we removed 4 of these items based on that, just that it was very low variance. And then we did a principal components analysis with the rest. If you're not familiar with what that is, basically we're just looking at, we're trying to take all 65 variables, so all activities, and then reduce them into groups that maximizes the variance explained. So based on, using that, we got 5 components based on the scree plot. And we removed any items that didn't load at least 0.32 on one of the categories. So it'll reveal how we interpreted these components at the end. So just real quickly, you can think of how you might interpret this, but these were the activities that loaded on component 1. So camping, hiking, parkour, geocaching, fishing, driving. We called this navigation. Component 2, we had 4 different video games questions. It's just slightly different video games, but also some team sports like football, baseball, some other games, chess, Pokemon Go. So we called this gaming, but also like competition. Component 3 were all the drawing, sketching, painting, embroidery, but also some athletic activities like gymnastics that also involve like a creative, expressive component to them. So we call this creative and artistic. Component 4 were all the other sports. So these are just stuff you might not do competitively. You still can, but it's like racquetball, for example. You can do it just for exercise. It also has like jogging, in-person shopping. So we called this fitness, or just like being generally active. And the last component, programming, web design, circuitry, drawing maps, we just call this like technical stuff. I think this might correlate with the with Lauren's map borders task. Maybe that's just guessing. So let's look at how these correlated with our measures. So the top 3 are all small scale tasks. The bottom 3 are large scale. So navigation, our first component, it did correlate with 2 of the 3 large scale tests. So that's good. That makes sense. It didn't correlate with the small scale tests. That's good. Gaming and creative both correlated with several of the small scale, the mental rotation measures. A couple of the large scale on creative, but sense of direction was negative. Fitness didn't correlate with anything. That was just sort of like general going out and doing things with your friends was kind of how I thought of that. So it makes sense too. And then the technical category did load on or correlate with sense of direction. So let's look at the sex differences. So on navigation, the first component, we had no difference between men and women. They participate in, at least from our sample, in those activities equally. So that's pretty interesting. Gaming and creative, we saw a large difference in opposite directions. So in gaming, men play a lot more video games. Women participate more in the creative and artistic activities. And then we saw smaller differences that one was significant on the other 2, but probably won't go into that too much. So to sum up, we have this new questionnaire about spatial activities. We started with 65 items, reduced that to 53. It now has large and small scale spatial activities. It also has modern activities that didn't exist when the original SAQ was invented. And then it's important to revise these periodically to take account of cultural and technological changes. We had 5 interpretable components, or maybe you saw them, maybe if you agree or disagree with the interpretableness of those. But yeah, and we validated them against our spatial ability measures. So the navigation component made sense. It correlated with the large scale measures, not the small scale. And gaming and creative both correlated with small scale. The sex differences were kind of interesting because there was no difference in participation of navigation activities, which is consistent with, there's some work where there's a relatively smaller sex difference for large scale spatial ability versus small scale. And navigation has generally not been included in these studies. So that's interesting. That might change the outcome there. And then we also had men played more games, women had more creative hobbies, but both categories related to mental rotation. This contrasts with some of the older studies where masculine activities benefit mental rotation. So here we're seeing both, I guess you could say. And then this still supports the general idea that spatial experience of some kind contributes to spatial ability. Some limitations, this was all college age, all at one university, so there might be a difference in what region you ask people about their hobbies in. The correlations were small, but again, around 0.3, that's what we were seeing before in other work, so it's not surprising. This was all administered online, so we couldn't control how, how well people did the tasks. Some future direction. So this doesn't say anything about the causal direction. We don't know if the activity experience is what's improving the spatial ability, or if people who are better at spatial thinking gravitate towards these activities. So that would be nice to look at. We're also using this in a big VR study with a bunch of different measures of large and small scale, like objective spatial measures and other cognitive abilities. So we will be able to say more about that. Okay, so thanks to everyone. Thanks to Mary Hegarty, my advisor. That's our lab on the left. And then thanks to Bailey and Liz Krassel at UC Irvine, and that's their lab. And then thanks to Danielle Harris for providing some insight based on her spatial activities work at Canberra. Thank you.
Hi, because I'm asking the obvious question, but what's with the negative correlation between creativity and sense of direction, or the creative factor?
Yeah, I don't know how meaningful that is. We did see a lot more women participating in creative hobbies, and generally men have a higher on the sense of direction questionnaire that we use. So it could just be because of that. It is kind of a small correlation. So I don't think that creative activities would make you worse at navigation, but that's speculative.
We do have technically two questions in the chat. I'll ask the first one first. Could you comment on the rationale behind selecting the specific spatial tasks? For example, why not include a Vandenberg version of the mental rotation test?
Right. So it kind of just time constraints, I guess. We will compare this to, actually it's the Shepard and Metzler in the other study, but it'll be a similar one. These were, we had multiple mental rotations just to test them for another study. So it wasn't like these were specific. It was kind of just to get some general spatial measures. So yeah, that would be good. I think that would be good to use. And usually the higher sex differences are on the Vandenberg mental rotation, not as high on these.
Okay, thank you. And then the second part of this question is, it's great that you included modern activities, but how do you consider cultural differences in some of these activities, like ping pong?
Right. Yeah, that's something we can't really account for with this, because it was all, well, I mean, it was all students at our university, but they all come from different places. So we did have a demographics questionnaire in this, but we didn't really look at it too much. So yeah, that's something I think as regions and cultures change, you will get different hobbies that people do, and they might even have different effects, like playing the same sport, but just a different culture around it could change that. So yeah, that's a good question.
So, hi, Mitch. So one of the things that's always a problem with these kinds of questionnaire studies is that we're assuming as experimenters that we have some idea what spatial activities are, what activities take spatial ability, but we actually don't know that.
Right.
So my pet example, and your results actually support this, are the sports, the one that didn't correlate with anything, because if you go to what the sports are, people are very convinced that all this bowling, volleyball, whatever.
Right.
I love in-person shopping as a sport, but whatever.
Well, yeah.
That those take spatial ability, but honestly, many sports are really about sensory motor, rehearsed routines, and not exactly rehearsed routines to some extent, but also the very quick calculation of arcs and so forth. And that is not at all what you do in spatial ability tests. So I'm wondering if at some point we just need to let go of the view that these activities are spatial or ought to be spatial. They're just stereotyped that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think especially these, I think they might just not do a whole lot for at least the way we're measuring spatial ability. And I mean, there are some sports, I guess, that might, just based on this, a couple sports, football and baseball. But yeah, I think you're right. We are adding sort of our own.
So that is funny because you're looking at the weights there, but then when you
Oh.
look at the correlations of if you go back to the one that has football and baseball, the correlation could be carried by some of the other things on it, like the video games with first person navigation,
Right.
rather than by football. And so again, like I said, we have a chicken and an egg problem here, and I'm not quite sure how to get past it with this mode of research. I think we're going to have to break out of it to really come to grips with what each activity actually requires.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point.